Hi, my name is Seanagh Fannin and I'm a director at Carrick Athena. Women are goal-based investors. As such, we need to think about a goal that we want to reach, like sending our kids to university or buying a house or making sure that we have enough to retire, and we work back from there. So we think about what that goal is and we think about a figure that we have in mind, and then we try and work back from there. However, many of us leave our retirement planning to our spouses and hope that it's being covered. And that's just not going to serve you very well. The truth of the matter is that 74% of women die single. And what you want to be sure about is if that happens, you don't discover at the last moment that there just isn't sufficient cash. A short story here. A client of mine came up to me last week after a seminar that we gave, and she was telling me about her husband, who insisted that she never worry about having enough money for when they retire. She decided to make a small investment all the same, and she put a little bit of money away every month. Her husband has recently retired, and it turns out that her husband, a lawyer, actually didn't understand all that much about investing, and he didn't understand how much he should be saving. With the impact of COVID, his tenants moved out of the house he had bought to provide a constant rental income stream. The tenants have opted for a life in the countryside, and now with the cities becoming a little emptier day by day, he just cannot sell the house. He is now relying on her salary, and she has 7 years left in order to build enough assets for them to live the rest of their years. Statistically, women outlive their husbands by 5 to 7 years. This client isn't sure whether she will still have enough for herself once he has passed away. So having sufficient wealth really is important, because if you don't have sufficient wealth, it'll mean one of two things. Either you decrease your expenses dramatically on retirement, or you get someone else to help you pay for your retirement, like your children. And if it's going to be your kids, then you need to let them know that as soon as possible so that they too can plan. And is there another way to go about this? Yes, there is. It's to have a plan. Have a seat at the financial decision-making table, the family financial decision-making table, and learn and understand what your family financial situation looks like, and decide together what you're going to do about it. It's for this reason that we decided to do this investment series on YouTube, so that you can be informed, ask us, consult with us, and ultimately start taking control of your money, your own money. In episode 1, we looked at basic investing and what it's all about. In episode 2, we looked at returns, what they mean, and the various elements that can erode them. And now we start to look and see how much you need to actually hold, and the rule of 50, 30, 20%. Understanding your figure and how much you need. So what is this all about? So I've already told you that as women we are goal-based investors, that we like to think of a figure and then work backwards. So how do we even start to comprehend how much we need? How do you figure out what your pot of wealth is? And just a reminder, in case you haven't done our episode 1, what we're trying to come up with is a pot of wealth that, invested at a certain return, can earn us sufficient wealth to live off month by month. And it's the same way you go about thinking about any goal that you have, whether it's university or it's vacations or whatever it may be. You're trying to think of a set figure and how you can work backwards. So what are your goals? Your goals could be a holiday, it could be a retirement, or rather your retirement. It could be a house. It could be leaving money to the next generation. So choose your goal, and when thinking about your goal, don't forget that what you're doing is planning your life. Not just a party or a holiday, you're planning your entire life. You're wanting a roadmap to financial freedom. You're wanting an easy way to consider your investments and make sure that you're going to have enough for all those very important things that are so important to you. And this is where planning happens. And this is how you create the options of freedom to do whatever it is that you want in whichever country that you want. You sit down with a cup of tea and think about who you are and what you personally want out of your life. So how do you know your figure? How do you work out your number, your bag of wealth? How do you know how big to make that? Well, you actually need to start with your biggest expense and put that into perspective. If I had to say, you can stop working today and I will pay your monthly income for the next 40 years, how much do you think I would need? Seems almost inconceivable to try and imagine that figure. I mean, how do you begin to fathom that amount? Would it be $1 million? Who knows? For most of us, this is just too huge an amount to even start to comprehend. And so what we do is we just ignore it and we hope it'll go away. Honestly, that's how I feel every single time I go to a fancy dress party. I just ignore it and hope that it'll go away until the day of the event. And when I'm filled with dread, trying to piece something together and wondering why I'd just not planned better, and ask my friend down the road who knows about these things. Well, financial planning's a lot like that. Ask the friend down the road who knows about these things. I cannot tell you how many people I meet who have not saved sufficiently for their retirement. They just didn't get around to it. When you ultimately retire, that is when you are no longer able or capable of working. And I say it in this fashion because so many people just don't have enough in savings. People like to think that they'll retire early. They'll say, oh, I'll retire when I'm 50. But actually, retirement is when you can no longer work at all. And at that point, you need to make sure that your pot of wealth is going to last you the rest of your years. So what if there was actually another way to achieve this other than ignoring it? We want to be able to determine how much we need, invested at a certain return, let's say 10%, that will generate enough income to meet our monthly expenses. That's what we're trying to do. Fine. So let's consider how we work out our figure and how do we reach it. Well, there's very many complicated ways to do it, but there's also quite a simple way to go about thinking of it. So in episode 1, I explained to you the bag of money. That's what we're trying to figure out. How big does that bag of money need to be? In episode 2, I spoke to you about returns. We've spoken about that. And then we talked about the amount of money that we need to generate per month. Fine. So that's actually where you start. You essentially think of how much you spend a month on a big month, Christmas, for example. Maybe it's 20,000 Rand, maybe it's 40,000 Rand, maybe it's 100,000 Rand. Doesn't really matter, it's your figure. And now you're going to work out how much you need per year. So I'm going to just go middle of the range and assume that we need 50,000 Rand a month. Fine. So what do? We take 50,000 Rand, we multiply it by 12 months, and we figure out how much we need per year. We need 600,000 Rand a year in order to live. So if my pot of wealth can generate at a return of 10%, an amount of 600,000 Rand, and I'm just living off that 600,000 Rand, I'm never ever going to run out of cash. I'm going to be good. Now there are things that we need to take into account, things like inflation. So my 50,000 Rand could be more and more each year, so that's fine. That just means my pot of wealth needs to be better, or my rate of return needs to be better. So if I'm needing to generate 600,000 Rand and I've got an investment return of 10%, then my pot of wealth needs to be 10 times the amount that I'm trying to generate. I need 6 million Rand, invested at 10% will generate me 600,000. If I don't have 6 million Rand, it means that I'm going to have to decrease my expenses, because at some point I'm going to start eating away at that capital portion, and I'm trying to avoid that. But as per the last episode, when we were looking at investment returns, we know that there are quite a few things that erode your returns. So you can have things like inflation or Rand depreciation or fees or taxation. And so 10%, to achieve 10% after all of those things, that's quite aggressive. You would have to invest quite aggressively, or you would have to build a very, very good structure in order to make that figure work. So I want to look at the worst case scenario. Let's assume that my return was only going to be 5%, so half of what I was talking about earlier. And in order to achieve the same story, a pot of wealth invested at 5%, that's generating 600,000. In order to do that, I need to double my pot. So my pot needs to be at least 12 million. So if you create this pot of wealth, it means that you're essentially going to be financially free. Fantastic. If you don't create that pot of wealth, what happens then? Then you're likely going to have to curb your expenses. You're essentially going to have to say, well, I'm not going to spend 50,000 Rand a month. I'm only going to spend 30,000 Rand a month because I don't have enough. So this is, again, once you've reached retirement, you're not building your wealth. You're now looking and going, this is it. This is how much I've got. How am I going to structure it? This is how you go about structuring it. So if you don't have that big pot of 12 million, you're going to have to curb your expenses, or again, you're going to need to ask somebody to help you pay for your retirement. And that you ideally want to avoid. So if you understand where you need to get to for retirement, your biggest expense ever, remember that you're going to be retired for like 40 years. So that's going to be your biggest expense. If you know where you're going to need to get to for retirement, then you can work out where you need to get to for holidays. You're going to downsize your expenses. You're going to make sure that you make use of compound interest and invest as much as you can as soon as possible to reach that retirement goal. And that's really going to indicate to you how much you can spend on holidays, etc. So as discussed, there are many ways to achieve this, but most importantly is get your money offshore into hard currency, so that you're not having to play with this rand depreciation. So is there an easier way to go about thinking about it? Yes, there is, absolutely. It comes down to how much time you've got in order to achieve your goal, but essentially this introduces the 50%, 30%, 20% rule. So 50% goes to your needs, like rent or medical aid or fuel or whatever it is that you need to actually run your life. 30% goes to things like wants. Those are things like holidays and cappuccinos and clothes. And don't get me wrong, life is very much about living. So 30% and spending things on things you want to do is really important. I'm very much for enjoying the life that we live. But I've also seen so many people who didn't save enough for retirement. So the last 20% goes to future you. And future you is the retiree you. This is money that you never, ever touch until the day you retire. So when looking at breaking up your salary or your income, you start with future you, because it's kind of like paying a tax. It's money that is not yours. It's money for future you. So 20% is going to cover the next 40 years of your life when you retire. And yes, you may have started saving far too late for future you, but it's okay. Just getting started is really what's key here. Remember the effects of compound interest. Maybe you don't retire when you're 65. Maybe you retire when you're 75, but understanding that equation is really what's important. From today forward, for the rest of your life, every tiny bit of income you earn, I suggest you put 20% to future you. Move it out the moment it comes in. Move that money out before you pay the tax man. Pay yourself first. Put that 20% into an investment and just leave it to grow. You never ever touch it. Whether it's a discount or a tiny bit of an income or it's a donation, 20% goes to future you every single time. Teach your kids this and they will never ever be short of money. These funds are not yours to touch. They are there for the day you retire. You need to think about them, as I said, like being a tax. They simply do not belong to you. If you do this calculation and you discover that 20% is not actually going to get you to your pot of wealth, the amount that you need when you retire, then you need to do one of two things. You need to consider saving a little bit more, so maybe you allocate 30% of your income, or you need to consider decreasing your expenses dramatically at retirement. But here's the thing. Thinking that you're going to decrease your expenses 20 years from now probably won't happen. If I had to say to you, yeah, I'm not going to spend as much as I do this month, next month, I'm really going to, cut back. We tend not to do that very well. So rather increase your savings, make sure that you're putting more towards it, which will mean by virtue of the fact that you've increased your savings, you've got less to spend on other things. So that's the 20% to future you. 50% goes to needs. That's from your salary, 50% is going to be paying off rent, it might be maintenance, it might be medical aid, it might be fuel, as I said. If you discover that your needs are far greater than 50%, then you're living beyond your means. So you should only be spending 50% on your needs. And again, if it's too expensive, you need to downsize, you need to find a cheaper rental, you need to really look at your life and see what it is that you're spending on. The final 30% goes to wants. As mentioned, life is all about living and it's about enjoying things, and I really advocate that you do that. So this 30% goes to wants, but it is the last portion of your salary or your income that you actually allocate to some kind of spending. Wants are things like entertainment or clothes or parties or all those things that are not essential to you living your life. Most people put food into the needs category, but most of us are foodies and we like to spend and we like to go out and eat at restaurants. And if you think about what it is that you're spending on, well, can you survive on eggs and grow your own vegetables? Yes, you probably can. You might not want to, but you definitely can do that. So that's a need. Anything above that, if you're eating caviar and drinking champagne, that's logically falling into the wants category. So food is a a tricky subject because it's definitely you need it in order to stay alive, but people tend to spend fortunes on food and alcohol. And the last thing that one wants to take into account is the emergency fund. So I didn't include it at the beginning, but the emergency fund is absolutely vital. You must have 3 to 6 months worth of income that is easy to access from some kind of savings fund. The savings fund doesn't have to be invested aggressively, it must just be there when you need it. And this is purely for emergencies, like if you crash your car and insurance won't pay out, or you've lost your job. If you've saved this up, you've got 6 months worth of income to tie you over until you find another job. Or let's say COVID hits, you've got 6 months to overcome all the obstacles that we were thrown with COVID. Or let's say, for example, you need to get out of a toxic relationship. You have 6 months to make sure that you can actually make that move safely and without being concerned about finances. So if you don't already have an emergency fund, then I would suggest starting by putting 5 or 10,000 Rand or as much as you can afford into this emergency fund. Where's that money going to come from? That's going to come from your 30% allocation of wants. So you're going to cut back on eating out. You're going to make a plan, but you're going to make sure that you've banked that money, because when you need that money, you'll be so grateful that you had it. Should you ever use your emergency fund, you must make sure that you always top it up. That money must always be available to you. In summary, know how much you need for each one of your goals, see how much you can save and whether the effects of compound interest can help you. So make sure that you know what your figure is for retirement and make sure that you're actually getting there. If you need any help, ask us. Going forward and forevermore, save 20% of anything you earn for future you. Pay yourself first. It becomes very easy once you start getting into the habit of it. Then work out what you need. This must not be more than 50% of your income. Again, if you're spending more than your 50% of your income, you're living beyond your means. And lastly, allocate once. So all the fun things, unfortunately, they fall into the last category. In our next episode, we'll be looking at how to structure wealth, onshore versus offshore when you retire. So wealth preservation. It's really, really good. You may not be at retiring stage, but it's really good to know how this starts to flow and how building up offshore investments now really will help you down the line. It also helps to indicate what kind of investments you should be investing in. Is property such a good investment? Property is a great investment, but understand where it is in the grand scope of things when you start to retire. Save, grow, live. Carrick Athena, a wealth advisory for women, by women. Thank you for joining us.